Timelines. A word that when said aloud, most of the time leads to people thinking about games like Zelda, maybe even Metroid, or maybe even Sonic. But most of the time, people don't really associate the word timelines with Star Fox. Now, Star Fox is a series that doesn't have a whole bunch of titles under its belt, but the games it does have has told a somewhat continuous story. However, this series has gotten rebooted several times, and most people really don't believe that this series has any sort of massive timeline that spans over the entire franchise. But what if I were to tell you that this series not only does have a franchise-wide timeline, but every time that the series has been rebooted, there's actually been a real in-universe reason for it? Well, that's what we're going to be taking on today. So sit back and relax and set those Gene fuses to max, because today we're boosting right into the insane theory of the Star Fox timelines.
Good luck.
Okay everyone, first and foremost, I need to establish something really quick before we get too deep into this theory. I won't be taking any external media into consideration for this theory, mainly because Star Fox actually has a lot of external media, both in mangas, comics, external player guides, the works. And because there's so much, a lot of it contradicts itself. So I'll be solely focusing on the games themselves and the information that's presented to us from them, mainly because all the games are consistent in their stories and lore throughout all the regions. With the only major exception to that rule being Farewell Beloved Falco, which I will include in this video's timeline, only because it fits really nice in between Star Fox 64 and Adventures and doesn't really have any contradicting points. So with all that in mind, let's finally get started and go over the history of Star Fox, so that way everyone's on the same page. Star Fox first began its life as the first ever 3D title on the SNES that sported the brand new Super FX chip, and this title released back in 1993 from Argonaut Software. And when this title did see release, it was met with extreme praise. Not only was it far beyond anything that Nintendo had created at the time, but it actually led to several other things, like an entire competition that was held using a modified version of the game, known as Star Fox Super Weekend, as well as an entire comic line from Nintendo Power. Due to the success of Star Fox 1, this would eventually lead to a sequel being created by the same team called, well, Star Fox 2. However, this would actually become one of the most infamous cancellations in all of gaming, hell, in all of Nintendo's history, because it ended up getting canceled right before 1997 in favor of the Nintendo 64. However, we would thankfully get a release of this title in 2017 on the SNES Classic. After this, in 1997, we would end up seeing the release of Star Fox 64, and it would reuse a ton of assets from Star Fox 1 and Star Fox 2, and actually end up retelling the story of Star Fox 1, but with several key differences, like how Fox's father disappeared, as well as the tech used in the Lilat War. Now, Star Fox 64 was seen with critical acclaim, and to this day is considered one of the Nintendo 64's best releases ever, and most Star Fox fans point to this being one of the greatest, most polished Star Fox experiences you can have, and I do kind of concur with that. But to follow the success of Star Fox 64, we would actually get a release in 2002 that was vastly different than anything else, called Star Fox Adventures, that featured Fox McCloud on foot and an entire Zelda-like game. And to follow this, we would actually get the release of a manga known as Farewell Beloved Falco in the same year, that took place right in between Star Fox 64 and Star Fox Adventures. Now, after these two releases, we would eventually get what I would consider to be one of the greatest Star Fox games ever, Star Fox Assault. And this title further advanced the franchise both in its lore and its gameplay, and it saw release in 2005. And this was then followed up by the release of Star Fox Command, which had a multiple ending system and was meant to be a possible ending to the mainline games, from Star Fox 64 to Assault. However, after the release of Star Fox Command, the entire franchise ended up going completely dark, and we didn't get a new game, let alone any new information on the franchise, for years. At least, that was the case until the Wii U released. During this console's lifespan, we would eventually get a soft reboot to the Star Fox franchise, known as Star Fox Zero, that came out in 2016, and it reused many, and I mean many, assets between Star Fox 64, Star Fox 1, and even, once again, Star Fox 2. Now, on top of this, Zero would also end up being bundled with another game, called Star Fox Guard. This was a spin-off game that came out in the same year, which told a side story that occurred during the events of Zero. And that then leads us to our last entry. 2 years after the release of Zero and Guard, we would finally get one more game for the franchise that released in 2018, known as Star Fox Atlas. But more people know it as the Star Fox DLC for Starlink Battle for Atlas. This takes place right after the events of Zero and Guard, and was exclusive DLC for the Nintendo Switch. And the DLC here is pretty intensive, and effectively turns Starlink into kind of its own Star Fox game. In fact, the entire Star Fox team has custom dialogue all throughout the entire main story. And as of now, this is actually the last thing we have gotten for the Star Fox franchise. And sadly, it has been a few years since we've gotten anything else. Most games in the Star Fox franchise normally follow a set style and or set events. But the 3 games that determine the general setup of the rest of the titles are Star Fox 1, 64, and finally Zero. Each of these games, as I've already mentioned, retell the events of the Lilat Wars. However, these retellings, despite their similarities, are vastly different, whether it's because of their tech or the general circumstances surrounding the Lilat Wars beginning. So with all the general setup finally out of the way, let's get ourselves some timelines set in stone.
Good luck.
Alright, there's about 9 releases game-wise that actually impact the franchise's lore, so we'll start off by placing each game in the respective timeline, and designating each timeline with its own title. Now thankfully, all the Star Fox games that are related to one another all released right around the same time, so we'll go through this by release date. To start us off, let's go all the way back to Star Fox 1, which released in 1993. And this starts off what I like to call the FX timeline. This timeline pretty much only contains 2 major releases, being Star Fox 1 and the cancelled and re-released Star Fox 2. And this timeline is pretty much based on the original Lilat Wars that began in 1993 with Star Fox 1. Second up, we have the 64 timeline. This series of events contains Star Fox 64, Farewell Beloved Falco, Star Fox Adventures, and finally Star Fox Assault. These games all tell a single continuous story based around the Lilat Wars that began in Star Fox 64. Now, after that, we have our third branch, known as the Command timeline. This game is all on its own, as its very continuity in the Star Fox 64 timeline has already been brought into question multiple times. Alongside the game having multiple endings, which creates a 9 timeline split from it, we also have the main dev stating that this game is not canon to the mainline titles that started in Star Fox 64 and led to Assault. And that just leaves our final branch, what I have dubbed the Zero timeline. This focuses only on 3 major releases, that being Zero, Guard, and finally Atlas. Now, Zero does retell the events of the Lilat Wars. However, this one has an astonishing amount of variation when compared to SF1 and 64. First off, the tech of the Star Fox team is far more advanced in this game than in any of the other previous retellings in SF1 and 64. In fact, the team is actually sporting some of the same tech featured in Star Fox 2. Alongside this, we also have Andross sporting very similar tech found in SF1, and the start of Zero also states that the Lilat Wars have gone on for several years at this point, which is very different from SF1 and 64, where the Lilat Wars began and was resolved in a very short span of time. Zero also states that Pikmin was not a main member of the Star Fox team back during James McCloud's days, but rather a volunteer for the mission to Venom. All this combined pretty much makes Zero's retelling of the Lilat Wars the most unique when in comparison to the other 2. And that is our final timeline. Each of these different branches tell a vastly different set of events. However, even with all these games in their own respective timelines, which isn't all that hard to figure out, that still leaves one more major question. How exactly did these timelines split? Each of the games start off at the same place, the Lilat Wars, and yet each of the retellings are extremely different, whether it's in tech or whether it's the outcome of that war. So with all that in mind, let's finally get into the real meat of the video, and find out exactly where and when these major timeline splits actually occur.
Good luck.
Okay, we've established our games, and we also now have established where they all rest on their own respective timelines. We also now have a general order of events that have occurred in each of these lines. So let's see exactly where each of them branch off. Let's start off with an easy one, by first covering the command divergence. This branch occurs right after the events of Starfox Assault, where a brand new enemy comes to power known as the Anglers that came from Venom's Oceans. This title sees the Fox team breaking away and later reforming, and depending on your actions will lead to 9 different endings, each with wildly different outcomes. Now, first, we do know for a fact that this does take place right after Starfox Assault, in an alternative timeline no less. Not only are the Aproids mentioned by name, but there are many other key events from the 64 timeline that are referenced. However, we know that this title isn't in the main timeline because of a statement from Dylan Cuthbert, which I've already mentioned previously. Now, for those that don't know, Dylan is actually the same dev who made SF1, SF2, and even SF64 3D, which was a remake of Star Fox 64 for those that don't know. And Dylan has already stated that this game has its very own timeline and has no true canon ending. Meaning that Command not only creates what I have dubbed the Command Split, aka the 9 different outcomes, but it also has its very own continuity that does parallel the events in the Star Fox 64 timeline, but is an entirely different outcome to those events. Now, as far as the actual branching point from the Star Fox 64 timeline is concerned, that actually ends up leading into the Command timeline, it most likely was due to the team splitting off in the first place. Not only is the team left in complete disarray after the events of Assault, where Fox is on his own with Rob and acts nothing like his previous iterations, but Falco is flying solo, Slippy's retiring with his own girl, Puppy's taking over the Cornerian army, and yet never supplies the Fox team with any of the new tech or upgrades, even though this has been done in the past. What the fuck? And finally sees Crystal joining Starwolf after her and Fox have a falling out. And all of this combined together pretty much leads the creation of the Command timeline, which, funny enough, also implies that the 64 timeline's true outcome most likely sees the team still being together and most likely getting better tech, which is also relieving to hear. So, with the easy branch off finally done, let's get to the far more difficult branching points: the Lylat Wars themselves. Now, to figure out exactly what caused the multiple split between SF1, 64, and 0, let's look into all the major differences. First off, there's actually the timing of the wars. We know for a fact that each of the wars takes place at different points, with SF1 most likely taking place the earliest, and 0 taking place the latest. The best evidence of this is actually the tech available to the Fox team in each timeline, and I will be using that tech as our guide going forward. And for anyone that might actually disagree with me doing so, I actually have some evidence to back up my reasoning. In the 64 timeline, we're already shown that tech that is available to the Fox team evolves over time. From 64 to Adventures, we're shown that the team's equipment is in complete disarray, with the actual Great Fox sustaining some serious damage. But when the team gets the proper funding from Adventure to Assault, they actually showcase the team's R-Wings, Landmasters, and even the Great Fox in an extremely advanced state that puts the SF64 versions to shame. This all means that the technology in the Star Fox series is very consistent and evolves over time, which again gives us an angle to work with, and I'm gonna take it. First off, in SF1, we only have access to the R-Wing Mark I. This vehicle does not have access to all range mode or alternative transformations. Alongside this team has no Landmaster or Blue Marine, and doesn't even have a Great Fox, but rather, at the start of the game, actually comes out of a central base, most likely the main hangar bay that the R-Wings are originally kept at Space Dynamics. And for those that don't know, Space Dynamics is the corporation that actually created the R-Wings. These R-Wings are also unmodified by Slippy, and sees the team in a far more last-ditch effort state. The team wouldn't get any major advancements in tech until SF2, where the team would finally get their own version of the Great Fox, known as the Mothership. Alongside this, we also saw the creation of several new R-Wing types, and each of them having a brand new ability to transform into a walker state for planetary traversal. Next up, we have Star Fox 64. Not only does the team sport a new variant of the R-Wings that all feature all range mode, but the team also gets access to the Great Fox, which has some major weaponry. And alongside this, they also get several vehicles like the Landmaster and Blue Marine. And all these vehicles are actually modified and or created by Slippy Toad. This implies that the team had some time to get familiar with the tech and even modified it before entering the Lylat Wars, which would also imply that the events of Star Fox 64 takes place at a later point than Star Fox 1. And finally, we have Star Fox 0. This is the furthest point of the Lilat Wars. Not only does the war go well over 5 years at this point, but the team has gotten far greater equipment than any of their previous iterations. The team has access to the latest and greatest version of the R-Wing, which has already been equipped with the Walker mode, which is something that the 64 team wouldn't even get, and they also had access to the Gyro Wing and even the Landmaster, which also has been modified to have its own transformation known as the Gravmaster. The Great Fox is also far sleeker than its previous variants in the other Lilat Wars and is utilized far more often. And to top it all off, the other major powers in the war, like the Cornerian and Venom armies, have far more advanced and powerful tech, which implies a longer stretch of time. This all means that each variant of the Lilat Wars takes place at alternative intervals, and due to this, we have alternative outcomes to each engagement. But this still leaves one major question. What exactly caused this variation? What caused the major timeline split to lead to SF1, 64, and 0 being so incredibly different? Well, for those that want to state the obvious, the actual reason for these variations is due to alternative artistic takes on the franchise. But that is dumb and boring. So what about an in-universe reason? Well, there are certain constants in the Star Fox franchise. The team's main members, Andross's banishment to Venom, just to name a few. But what has to be the biggest constant is Fox's father, James McCloud. In each timeline, James disappears and is presumed dead, but what leads to this changes. In SF1, Fox's father is sent off and ends up lost in a black hole, as told us by General Pepper in Star Fox 1. Because of this, the Star Fox team has far less time to prepare for Venom's mass attack, and the new team is formed somewhat rapidly between Fox, Falco, Slippy, and Peppy. This team uses the original R-Wings from Space Dynamics, with no modifications, and blasts off into battle as a last-ditch effort to save the Lilat system. Now, in Star Fox 64, James McCloud has formed his own Star Fox team with Peppy and Pigma. This leads to the team investigating strange readings from Venom, where they are betrayed by Pigma. This then leads Peppy to escape thanks to James' sacrifice. However, what exactly happens to James during the battle is still a major mystery, and James only ends up showing back up at the end of Star Fox 64 to guide his son to safety, but he also ends up communicating with Fox in other instances, like Star Fox Adventures. However, in Star Fox 64, when he does lead Fox out of the Venom main base, he ends up disappearing. And in Star Fox Adventures, he tells us some information that he shouldn't be able to know. This all implies that he's not only alive, but has some sort of higher consciousness. Furthermore, in the command timeline, James McCloud also makes an appearance, but only Fox can see him. However, James is able to destroy enemies and even take out bases, and this does affect gameplay, which would imply that James McCloud is able to interact with the environment around him in a pretty major capacity. And finally, that just leaves Star Fox 0. The same set of events happen as in Star Fox 64, but this time James's team did not originally have Pigma a part of it, but rather Pigma was a volunteer that joined the team at the last second. But this still also ends up leading to Pigma betraying the team. This again leads Peppy barely escaping and James staying behind to save him. And just like in 64, the events of that battle are still a mystery, with James reappearing at the end of 0 to allow you to land the killing blow on Andross. And at this point, we haven't seen him since in the 0 timeline. Now, after the events of James' supposed death in the 0 timeline, the Lilat Wars end up beginning, and the Star Fox team is formed by Fox McCloud 5 years into the war, granting the team enough time to gear up before venturing into the fray. Which then leaves the Fox team having far greater equipment than any of their other previous timeline counterparts. With all this in mind, whatever happens to James seems to directly impact the outcome of each timeline, meaning that James is actually our branching point. Depending on how the events play out with him, timelines shift accordingly. This just leaves us with one more additional question. Why? Why is James so important to the timelines, and why does his involvement come with such ramifications? Well, I sadly don't have a solid answer for this, but I do have an idea. Whatever happens to James during the 2 instances with Pigma obviously leads James to becoming some sort of higher being, with the ability to not only see the future, but somehow persist after death. This could very well mean that James on some level is not only able to perceive his home universe in a wider range, but is also able to interact with it with some degree and maybe even make changes. Again, we did see this at the very end of Star Fox 64 where he saves his son, and we also see this in Star Fox Zero. This could all mean that James himself, when becoming this higher being, makes slight changes in order to aid his son and the Lylat system. This could explain why each Lylat war is so different. That maybe James McCloud himself is altering events. Maybe he purposely delayed Fox entering the fray in the Lylat Wars in Zero so his team would have way better equipment. This could also mean that in Star Fox 1 to Star Fox 64, that depending on when James dies determines the outcome of those wars. Because James dies so early in SF1, Venom's attack is so much more sudden, causing the Star Fox team to be created so much more rapidly. But because James died far later in Star Fox 64 and Peppy's able to return to warn Pepper, this meant that the Cornerian army had more time to prepare, as well as the Star Fox team having more time to prepare, allowing Slippy to create modified equipment for them before they hopped into the fray. And with all these details under our belts, this also kind of leads to one more massive revelation. Out of every timeline, Star Fox 1 is probably the true prime timeline. The one timeline where James dies when he was supposed to and is never able to actually interact with Fox's universe in a major way. Think about it. Star Fox 1 features the Fox team not only forming far more rapidly, but features tech that's far less equipped. It's so much more of a last-ditch effort, but they still do it. They still win the Lylat Wars, but with zero involvement from James McCloud. But in every other timeline, in 64 and in Zero, James is involved in some fashion. Hell, even in Star Fox Command, James shows up out of nowhere. Now, yes, this is all a very big stretch. I understand that. There's a lot of conjecture and guesswork here, and this all sounds pretty nuts. But I feel like there's some serious merit to this. So, with all that said, let's finally put it all together.
Good luck.
Years ago, there was once a pilot known as James McCloud, an ace pilot that was well known throughout the galaxy for his extreme skill. He took part in many experimental flights, but one that he's most well known for is the flight of the R-Wing. He would eventually have a son known as Fox McCloud that wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. And for a time, things seemed to be just right. However, unbeknownst to Fox and his father, their greatest enemy is about to be born. A man known as Andross. This maniacal scientist nearly turned all of the Lylat system into a wasteland due to his dangerous experiments, and because of this, he was banished to Venom. Now, sometime after this, James McCloud would be tasked to investigate strange readings coming from Venom, where Andross was banished to. But when en route to that planet, for one reason or another, James McCloud ended up getting lost in a black hole, and was presumed dead. This would then lead to the events of Star Fox 1 and begin what would be known as the FX timeline. And because of this, Andross was able to launch an all-out assault on the Lylat system. This would then lead General Pepper to turn to a brand new Star Fox team that was created by Fox McCloud, Falco Lombardi, Slippy Toad, and Peppy Hare, who at this point were pretty much just mercenaries for hire. They will be equipped with the newest and baddest and most powerful vehicle available to the Cornerian army, being created by Space Dynamics, known as the R-Wing. But due to how powerful it was, only select top-tier pilots could actually operate it. And due to the time-sensitive nature of Andross' attack, the Fox team would jump into action nearly immediately, launching straight from Space Dynamics' central base and flying straight into the fray right off the bat. They would go through all of the planets and eventually make their way to Venom, to Andross' main headquarters, where Fox McCloud would go on his own and finally get his revenge after his father's death. Now, after Fox McCloud allegedly destroyed Andross, him and his team would return back to Corneria and be celebrated as heroes. And over time, the Star Fox team would actually expand with 2 additional members, being Miyu and Faye. Furthermore, the team would end up getting upgrades to their equipment, in the form of several new R-Wing types, as well as the R-Wings having the new ability for planetary traversal, transforming into the Walker. And to top it all off, the Star Fox team would finally get their own base of operations, known as the Mothership. Thanks to all this equipment, the Star Fox team was more than prepared for when Andross returned once again in the events of Star Fox 2, where he relaunched a brand new all-out offensive against the Lylat system. But thanks to Star Fox's new equipment and members, they were easily able to push back this offensive and put a stop to Andross once and for all. And once we do reach the finale of Star Fox 2 and play through the whole game, and finally land our last hit on Andross, this then brings us to the end of the FX timeline, where Andross is finally put into the ground for good. However, even if this is the end of the FX timeline, this is far from the end of the events that play out in the Star Fox franchise. If James McCloud does make it to Venom, we are open to the possibility of 3 different timelines. The first one is the 64 timeline. In this set of events, James McCloud makes it to Venom along with Peppy Hare and another member known as Pigma. But it turns out that Pigma is actually working for Andross and betrays the Star Fox team. In a massive battle, Peppy barely escapes thanks to James sacrificing himself. Once Peppy does make it back to Corneria, he alerts Fox to his father's fate and warns the Cornerian army about the new offensive building at Venom. But as far as James is concerned, he is presumed dead after the battle. However, this is not actually the case, as something occurs during this fight that leads to James's survival. Several years after all this happens, Fox McCloud eventually creates a brand new Star Fox team, and around the same time this occurs, the Lilat system is invaded by Andross, and so re-begins the Lilat Wars in the 64 timeline. However, thanks to Peppy being able to survive the events on Venom, and James's original team actually being able to make it that far to see the offensive that was building on the planet, this meant that the new Star Fox team headed by Fox McCloud had extra time to prepare. Not only did they have better R-Wings in comparison to the FX timeline with the added ability of having all-range mode, but they also were able to come equipped with additional vehicles, like the Landmaster and Blue Marine, both of which were created by Slippy Toad. And the team even got access to their very own mothership known as the Great Fox. And so, with all this new equipment in tow, the Star Fox team was far better equipped than their FX timeline counterparts. And this led them to jump right into the Lilat Wars of the 64 timeline. And this then leads Star Fox 64 finally taking place. Once Fox and his team do eventually reach Venom and put a stop to Andross once and for all, this would then lead them heading back to Corneria after a job well done, which then, after a little bit of time, would lead to Farewell Beloved Falco, a manga that pretty much showed Falco leaving the team, as well as showcasing a Cornerian army general actually turning out to be a traitor and trying to clone Andross. But thanks to the Star Fox team, they were able to put a stop to this cloning process before it went too far. Afterwards, this would then lead to the events of Star Fox Adventures, where the team was worse for wear and their equipment was practically falling apart. But thankfully, General Pepper would actually reach out to the team once more and ask them to check out Dinosaur Planet, as the entire planetary body was at risk of explosion. This then leads to the events of Star Fox Adventures taking place, where Fox McCloud travels through Dinosaur Planet and eventually meets and saves Crystal, and kills the very soul of Andross. Long story, we're not going to get into that here. About a year after this, the events of Star Fox Assault would finally take place, where Crystal would eventually join the team in an official capacity, and thanks to their new funding from the Cornerian army, the entire Star Fox team would receive massive amounts of new upgrades, like better R-Wings, Landmasters, as well as a complete overhaul to the Great Fox. And in fact, Star Fox's mothership would also receive another major upgrade, with the ability to transport R-Wings and Landmasters on a dime to just about any surface to any team member that might need it. Now, during the events of Star Fox Assault, the team would actually be brought in to help clean up the rest of Andross's forces after the events of 64. But as they do this, they end up encountering a brand new enemy known as the Aparoids, an insectoid-like species that sought to assimilate creatures and other technologies and bring them into their own collective. However, thanks to the hard work of the Star Fox team, these creatures would eventually be put down permanently, as Fox McCloud was able to inject the Queen with a self-destruct program. Now, with all that said, during the major events of the 64 timeline, James McCloud would actually intervene at some points. Whether it was at the end of the massive fight in Star Fox 64, where he would actually help save his son and lead him out of the massive complex, or in Star Fox Adventures, where he would give his son information from beyond the grave, which all points to James McCloud being in some form of a higher state of being, since he seems to have knowledge that no normal person should. Now, towards the end of the 64 timeline, we would end up getting one more additional timeline split, known as what I like to call the Command Divergence. In this small branch of the timeline, the Fox team ends up separating after the events of Assault, and reforms once again when a brand new enemy known as the Anglers come into power. This then leads to the events of Star Fox Command to play out. However, based on the choices of the player / the starfox team, Command could end up leading to one of 9 different endings, each of which with their very own alterations to the timeline. There's one where Fox and Falco join a racing league very similar to F-Zero, and another where Crystal becomes an outcast and turns bounty hunter. However, the Command timeline branch is purely a theoretical possibility to the ending of the 64 timeline, as it's not part of the timeline officially, and this split off from the 64 timeline most likely occurs once the team splits up. This then finally leads us all the way back to the initial split off during the Lilat Wars, with our final timeline branch, known as the Zero timeline. In this timeline, all the events from Star Fox 64 play out nearly the same. However, Pigma joins as a volunteer to the OG Star Fox team, not as an original member. And of course, once James and his team reaches Venom, it turns out to be a trap. And James once again stays behind to let Peppy escape, which then leads Peppy Hare to warn both Corneria and Fox McCloud of what happens. This would then eventually lead to the beginning of the Lilat Wars in the Zero timeline. But unlike the 64 or even FX timeline, where the Star Fox team would immediately jump into the Lilat Wars, in this timeline, the Star Fox team would only join once the war had already gone on for about 5 years. But thanks to that stretch of time, the Star Fox team not only gained connections, but also funding from the Cornerian army, which led them to getting the biggest and baddest tech available. Not only did the Star Fox team get their very own Great Fox, but the team also would get access to the greatest version of the R-Wing seen during the Lilat Wars. This version had all-range mode, gyro aiming, and even was modified with the Walker mode, which was only ever seen in the FX timeline in Star Fox 2. On top of this, the team would also have access to the Gyro Wing and Landmaster, and heck, even the Landmaster itself would end up having its very own custom modification known as the Gravmaster. And thanks to all these upgrades and additions, the Zero timeline version of the Star Fox team was far better off and prepared for the Lilat Wars than either their 64 or FX timeline counterparts. And because of all of this, they hopped into the war at full speed. This would then lead to the events of Star Fox Zero playing out as we all know, where Fox and his team would eventually get all the way to Andros' main home base and put a stop to him once and for all. And that's also in part to James McCloud appearing one more time to distract Andros long enough to allow his son to land the final blow. Now, during the events of Star Fox Zero taking place, we would also have the events of Star Fox Guard taking place at the same exact time. Now, Star Fox Guard is a rather insignificant portion of the timeline, and it doesn't really affect all that much, but I wanted to include it here for consistency's sake. With all that said, after the events of Zero and Guard finally happened, the team would then go off hunting down Wolf and his team after the conclusion of the Lilat Wars, which would actually eventually lead the team into the Atlas system, where the events of Star Fox Atlas would finally take place. And that is the entire Star Fox franchise-wide timeline. Now, yeah, I know this theory might sound pretty crazy. There's been tons of conjecture for sure, but I honestly believe that there is some genuine evidence for this timeline, and regardless if this is true or not, I would still like to think that this is at least plausible, and for me personally in my own headcanon, I'm always going to believe that there is a franchise-wide timeline, whether you believe it or not. And with all that said, guys, that does finally bring us to an end to this video. Guys, thank you so much for joining me with this awesome deep dive into the possible theory of multiple Star Fox timelines. It was a blast to look at all the evidence and try and piece together this crazy theory, and I had a lot of fun with it, and I hope you guys did too. But what do you guys think? Do you think that this franchise might actually have a massive interconnected timeline? Or do you think that this theory is just about as good as Slippy's piloting skills? I'd be curious what you guys all have to say down below. And with all that said, if you guys enjoy what you saw, please leave a like, subscribe, and comment, because support is always effing amazing. And again, thank you so much for joining me with this massive video. And without further ado, this is Jarosik signing out. I'll see you on the next one. And as always, don't forget to rock and roll!